Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse Sunday morning worship service. My name is Stephen Cook, and I'll be your celebrant this morning. My wife, Judy Brown, will be the speaker today. Judy and I are both agricultural economists, as is Joel Hamilton. Judy and I met as graduate students at Michigan State University. Today's topic is liberal religion compatible with liberal economics? Liberal religion assumes private virtue, love, leads to public virtue, community. Curiously, liberal economics assumes that private vice, selfishness or self-interest, leads to public virtue, prosperity. Judy will explore this apparent contradiction between liberal religious philosophy on the one hand and liberal economic systems on the other. But first, I'd like to extend a special welcome to all those who are joining us for the first time. We're very glad that you're here with us. Those first-timers here in person should have received a welcome packet with a card in it when you arrived. If you fill out the card and drop it into the offertory basket, we'll be in touch. In addition, the welcoming committee members identified with their yellow name tags are available to answer your questions. Are there some yellow name tag people? Elizabeth. Those joining us online for the first time can find a link to the UUCP website to new members' information. So, whether you're here or there, old or new, please know that you're welcome to join us downstairs for coffee and conversation after the service. Now, let's say a few words of welcome together. Whether this is your first or 1,000th Sunday with us, and whether you strolled, rolled, zoomed, ran, or danced in, we are glad you chose to join us. We are one people of many beliefs, identities, origins, sexualities, and genders. All are welcome here. Now let us take a moment to say hello across the technical divide. First, let's see the people joining us on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, please turn on your camera. Now people on Zoom, wave. Now people in the building, wave. Thank you. I have one announcement. The Service Auction Committee announces an upcoming resurrected 2023 goods and service auction on Friday, September 8th. So, August is the time to donate or request goods and services for the auction. For example, on the supply side, donate a good for an English-style ascending silent auction, i.e., something someone else will find that sparks joy, particularly something a cut above a yard sale item. For example, a dessert promissory note to be redeemed later. On the demand side, request or offer to pay for some type of good or service. To make your supply and demand known, go to the UUCP website and click on the word donate, or email directly Judy Lalonde at judybll@hotmail.com. That's the end of the announcements. Now for territorial acknowledgments. We preface our service by acknowledging our church is built on the ground of the Palouse, the ancestral homeland of two Native American tribal nations. The one nation is known from within as the Nimipu, which means we the people, and called by the French Canadians the Nez Perce. The other is known from within as the Shishun, those that were found here, and called by the French Canadians the Coeur d'Alene. So let us pause and remember that we occupy ground that is sacred, stolen, that is, the terms of the Treaty of 1855 were not honored, and crying out for both justice and responsible stewardship. By remembering, we may find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all her people. And now for the chalice lighting. I've asked Judy to do the honors. Now we hope that if people joining us on Zoom have a chalice candle to light, and that they will join us so that we may light our chalice candle and say and sing our chalice affirmation together. In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek and seek to share. From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and love arise. Let beauty, truth, and good be sung in every land, by every tongue. Thank you. I'm going to do the opening words this morning, and what I have selected are a series of statements regarding the issue of brother and sister versus other, from both the ideal and the real perspective. The first is from Rabbi Hillel from the 1st century AD. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for others, what am I? And if not now, when? And this from the Bible. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this, in the 18th century, from Mandeville, The Fable of the Bees, which is actually a poem, which is here interpreted by E.J. Humbert. Contemporary society is an aggregation of self-interested individuals bound to one another, neither by their shared civic commitment nor their moral rectitude, but rather, paradoxically, by the bonds of envy, competition, and exploitation. And this by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. It is his own advantage, indeed, and not that of society, which he has in view. But the study of his own advantage naturally and rather necessarily leads him to prefer that employment which is most advantageous to society. And this by Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarian philosophy. The decision rule for right and wrong action should be the greatest good for the greatest number. And this from Martin Luther King and Theodore Parker. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And finally, from John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Now for an opening hymn, please join together in singing, We Would Be One. And now, will the children of all ages come forward? My wife, Judy Brown, will read a story entitled Oxcart Man by Donald Hall, illustrated by Barbara Cooney. Now let's take a moment to engage in the practice of generosity together. For those who are able to make a financial contribution, the logistics are on your screen. We invite you to go to the website and donate. The web address is in the chat. For those of you newer and visiting from another part of the country, you may not be aware that we typically give away all of the cash from our Sunday offerings to local charities whose mission align with our values, a program that we call the Month of Sundays. This month, the recipient is the Circle of Caring Adult Day Health Foundation. Their mission is to provide social and therapeutic services for those with chronic illness and developmental disabilities, while allowing caregivers time off work to do chores and to rest. If you're donating online, you can choose the Month of Sundays from the drop-down menu on the UUCP website. If you are mailing or dropping off a check, simply indicate in the memo line the intended use, Month of Sundays or UUCP General Fund. In the spirit of love and for the continuing work of our children, we now take time to practice generosity together. Now is a time for joys and sorrows. Before I invite Elizabeth Berlinger up, I'd like to say a personal thank you to David Nelson for joining us today. It warms my heart to see you here. Elizabeth? Now is the time for meditation in word, silence, and music. First, the words. This by Warren Samuels, who is my Michigan State History of Economic Thought professor. The opposite of a small truth is a falsehood. The opposite of a big truth is another big truth. And one heck of an economist. She'll be talking today, are liberal education and liberal economics compatible?
Sorry, everybody. I'm going backwards in the service. We had a late sorrow from Karen Barron that came through online. So I just wanted to share that with everybody. She said that last Tuesday I played pickleball and took a flying leap at a ball and took a very bad fall. Thursday I went to the ER, 6 fractured ribs, 3 displaced, and a fractured shoulder socket. So she says, okay, no more pickleball. I'll have to take it very easy for a long time, but I will be okay. And thanks to science for pain meds. And yes, I have all the help and food that I need. So keep Karen in your thoughts. Thanks. Sorry, Judy.
Is that about right? Thanks. Well, I am presenting the talk today, but the truth is Steve and I developed this whole service together from beginning to end. It's provided quite a few interesting dinner conversations, and it's been fun, and I'd also say that sometimes we felt like we bit off a whole lot more than we could chew. And we kept in mind 2 things as we were doing this. One is that I think the summer services are directed at the question of what helps us craft meaning out of our lives, and so as a chance for the congregation, I guess, to get to know individual members a little bit better. And then secondly, there is kind of a conundrum that we were addressing, which is that liberal religions like ours assume that private virtue, love, leads to public virtue, the beloved community, and the common good. Curiously, liberal economics, economics in general, I would say, as Steve's readings show, are based on the idea that private vice, self-interest, if not greed, leads to public virtue, prosperity. And so we've been exploring the apparent contradiction between a liberal religious philosophy on the one hand that believes private virtue promotes public virtue, and economics that seems to believe that private vice promotes public virtue. Let's start with a few basics about economics. And don't think you have to remember any of this. There's no pop quiz at the end. Economic systems perform, you could say, 3 basic tasks. One is the allocation of resources. One is production and productivity, which has always been Steve's main interest, is productivity gains through technology and innovation and things like that. And then the third is the distribution of income, which is, has always been my main interest and opens issues in distributive justice, poverty, the significance of the gap between the rich and the poor, and so on. And the US economic system relies heavily, but by no means exclusively, on markets to accomplish these various functions. What's a market? A market is a man-made, and I'll put the emphasis on man-made because we're going to talk about human-made, I should say, later, a human-made institution for facilitating the exchange of goods and services. Theories about models and the behavior of markets rest on various sets of economic but also political assumptions. I'm going to run through the sort of idealized economic assumptions that have dominated what you could call the neoclassical economic model that's held sway for a long time. As I said, there's no quiz at the end. These are that producers, workers, and consumers act rationally, which simply means that they're goal-oriented. Producers are seeking to maximize profits, consumers their incomes and satisfaction, and so on. Second assumption is that the actors have perfect knowledge and information. The third is that goods and services are produced with diminishing marginal returns and consumed with diminishing marginal utility, which basically means that most goods are private goods. Private goods like food and clothing that it's relatively easy for an individual or an economic unit to produce and an individual economic unit to buy. The next one is that markets exist in an environment of perfect competition, which means that there are many buyers and sellers, and no one particularly influences the outcome of the market. That is, no monopolies or market concentration, that sort of thing. Next, producers and consumers have a given set of initial resource endowments. They come to the market with a certain set of knowledge and skills and income that enable them to participate in the market, and then the transactions proceed. And the last one is that economics cannot make what they call interpersonal utility comparisons among consumers, citizens, and so on, which is basically that economics doesn't itself make value judgments about who or what is most important. So first of all, these assumptions are very simplistic, almost to the point of being laughable. In fact, I can remember in introductory economics classes listening to students laugh at them, and I've heard them say that, I have heard it said that introductory economics are so detached from the real world and so idealized and or simplistic that it discourages a lot of people from pursuing economics. And I think economics is one of those fields where you don't really get to the interesting material until you're in graduate school. Secondly, the last two assumptions about initial resource endowments and interpersonal utility comparisons have very important, mean that very important decisions that have a big impact on the performance of a market are outside the purview of economics, but are nonetheless critical to the performance of a market. They lead to the inevitable interconnectedness of economics and politics. Economics and politics are inevitably interconnected. In fact, for a long time, economics was known as political economy for just that reason. Furthermore, the very simplistic model as outlined has little to say about public goods and systems of public choice, including government and taxation, that go with them. And as I said, the concept of initial resource endowments has all kinds of implications for distributive justice. So this is where things begin to get interesting, and it's also where conservative economics and liberal economics, speaking in very general terms, diverge. And I should say first, probably up front, that I am not a conservative economist. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the conservative bent, and I have tried not to be pejorative. I hope I'm not pejorative, and forgive me if I am. We did look at a number of what are usually called neoliberal websites, which is the term often used for conservatives these days, and found these kinds of statements. Conservative economic assumptions tend to place the emphasis on markets as the best means of transacting the exchange of goods and services, and believe that markets should be as free as possible from market intervention, and that markets involving minimum government control will adjust themselves automatically as per the laws of supply and demand, and free markets provide consumers with better choices. These have some implicit corollaries. One is that many public goods can be privatized and offered through the market. Public education is being eroded as we speak, and we see that the differences are quite different. Taxes are also considered a distortion to markets and should therefore be minimized. And in general, conservative economists tend to believe that government should not redistribute income. Liberal economics assumptions, on the other hand, tend to see the market, as I said, as a human-made institution that results from human-determined property rights, rules of representation, jurisdictional boundaries, and so on, that different assumptions and rules underlying a market result in different outcomes and performance. Many, if not most, public goods are not adequately provided through market mechanisms. Individuals, communities, and groups, given that this is a human-made institution, have every right to adjust the preconditions and associated property rights to change market performance so that it meets our goals, whether through regulation, public provision, or whatever. And here I was just going to make a note that another one of the things that set us onto this topic is that I hear a lot of comments these days about people not liking capitalism or being a socialist, or actually Axios put out a poll yesterday that showed that young people in this country, can't remember the exact ages, but maybe it's 20s and early 30s, a majority of them call themselves socialists. Well, once you start modifying markets to get different performances that you want, you end up with a mixed economy where you have some private markets, some regulation, some private provision. And that's what most economies in the world are today. And in fact, we have quite a bit of socialism if you think about our own economy, lots of public goods and services. So I'm not going to talk about capitalism, socialism, and communism much today. I'm just going to talk about different kinds of markets. So by redesigning how individual markets can work, it is possible to change the behavior, which might be called the private vice, of individual economic actors so as to support and promote the common good. The conundrum is resolved. And as Steve showed in the readings, we have all of these inspiring quotes about the common good. Don't be just for yourself, promote the common good, which is, I think, an inevitable human need. It should, at the same time, be recognized and emphasized that reconciling the interests of individual economic actors to promote the common good is a never-ending, messy, political community process. Public policy is a function of power, knowledge, circumstances, and so many other things. And when, at particular moments in history, these elements come together, as they have many times, then liberal economics has a very impressive track record of public policy accomplishments promoting the public good in the US. And I think oftentimes these need to be more recognized and celebrated. I have been reading a book called Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond, which has been on the bestseller, I think it recently went off the bestseller list, but it's been on the bestseller list for several months. And I was really fascinated because reading about poverty is generally fairly dry and tedious and not necessarily uplifting. So I've been wondering who in the world is reading this book to put it on the bestseller list. I don't know the answer to that question. But one of the points he makes is this idea that we have been through numerous times in which liberal economic policies have been enforced with great success. I mean, if you just look at from, say, 1900 on, Teddy Roosevelt in his Square deal made huge advances with regard to conservation, consumer protection, the regulation of corporations, honesty in government. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, you could list pages and pages of the accomplishments. Price controls, collective bargaining and other labor rights, state park systems, the national wildlife refuges, Social Security, and so on and so on. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, too, in the first 2 years of his presidency. You know, he had been in Congress for a long time. He was part of the class of 1948 that started implementing a civil rights agenda. And when he became president, he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he knew how to do it, and passed an incredible raft of legislation in those first 2 years before the Vietnam War started catching up with his administration. Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, housing rights, and on and on. He was followed by Richard Nixon, who in many ways had some fairly liberal outlooks. It was under Nixon that the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act were passed, the Earned Income Credit, which has for decades been our largest anti-poverty program, was started under him. And then if we go on, Clinton, history is yet to write the final chapter, I think, on the Free Trade Act, but he also worked really hard for the largest increase in the minimum wage in decades, expanded the earned income credit, and did other things as well. Obamacare is an incredible achievement, and he probably would have done a lot more if he hadn't had Alan Greenspan and the bankers to contend with. And then we come to Joe Biden and the pandemic. You know, the massive public spending that was spent during the pandemic had an incredible effect on poverty and also on just keeping so many people from going over the edge. And we're still recovering from the pandemic, but in terms of other countries, there are some things we didn't do right, but our stimulus packages have shortened the recovery in our country compared to other countries. And after the 2007 recession, which was when the housing bubble burst, it took 10 years for most people's incomes to return to, you know, on a society-wide basis, for levels of income to return. And in many ways, the recovery from that is still going on. It's taken less than a year from the pandemic for the economy to be booming again. And the author of this book was particularly talking about both the child care tax credit and the housing assistance programs that were monumental programs, extremely effective, and yet they don't seem to get the press that they needed. And the housing assistance program has elapsed, and the child care tax credit, I think the progressive community has great hopes that it will be made permanent, but it has not been made permanent yet. So my friend Linda Paul always used to say that it is very important to celebrate and to remember your accomplishments. And sometimes I think we need to do that and then keep trudging on. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. The whole summer, Judy and I have been talking about this topic. And it felt like we had enough information to sort of put together a graduate seminar on public policy by the time we were done. So a lot of it ended up on the floor or in the garbage can. One point that I hope to take out of the garbage can and present to you is the point that Judy made is that there are broad cycles between there are major movements forward in what we would call the liberal agenda. And in between, it can get very discouraging. You can go 20 or 30 years, you know, lots of election cycles when nothing happens. And that's for actually quite a good reason. People like Machiavelli pointed out that when people get in power, they don't stop being self-interested. They don't stop being selfish. They don't stop being cruel. In fact, and I think we've seen this in our own politics, it's an expression of that on a very large stage. And so what the Enlightenment said to policymakers was, the way to prevent the lesser angels in our character is to divide power so that one group is always checking the other. And so our government was developed during the Enlightenment, and so we have a Supreme Court that checks the Congress, we have a president that checks the Supreme Court, presumably through nominations. And so not much gets done because everybody is thwarting everybody else. And in a sense, that's a very good thing because very often what they want to do is very bad stuff. Every once in a while, and this happens, I wouldn't say it's an obvious cycle, but you can see between Teddy Roosevelt and his cousin Franklin and then LBJ and on to present day, you can get 30, 40 years of no major accomplishments. If you look at the 89th Congress of Lyndon Johnson, the things that they passed are astounding. They did more before lunch than we've done in the last 4 or 5 years. It's just remarkable what they were able to do. Why was that? Because in this democracy, you need supermajorities in the House, you need supermajorities in the Senate, you need the Supreme Court who doesn't negate everything, and a president that provides leadership. Now, what are the odds of that happening very often? Not very much. But it does happen occasionally. So I guess it's a message of hope. Hang in there. And don't talk about socialism. We've got a capitalist system that works just fine when we can get perception, power, and knowledge all working in the same direction. So I'd like Joel Hamilton to come on up here and give us his 2 cents about all of this. Joe, you've thought about these. Are you willing to do that, Joel? I apologize for putting you on the spot, but when you have a Berkeley PhD in the audience, what are you going to do, right? Thank you, Joel.
I am the third ag economist in this church. Thank you both for your graduate seminar in economic history. Actually, I managed to get a PhD without ever taking a course in economic history. Much of my reading was just on the side. My career has been very focused on international work, and one of the I think most enlightening assignments that I ever had was working in Uzbekistan, one of the former states of the Soviet Union. I was there soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union and its communist system. And I was asked to look at the possibility of the U.S. getting involved in helping to repair the irrigation system in the country. My discovery, probably to the consternation of the U.S. federal agency that was paying my bill, was that the governance of Uzbekistan and the way agriculture and irrigated agriculture was conducted was basically a remnant of the command economy of the old Soviet Union, not markets. And my conclusion in looking at the obsolete irrigation system that was being used, which was wearing out, it was built under Khrushchev, it was part of the "we will bury you" era of Soviet politics. And they were still trying to tell farmers when to plant crops, what varieties to plant, when to apply fertilizer, when to harvest it, when to, they had difficulty with harvesting because the old Russian cotton pickers had worn out and they couldn't afford to repair them. So basically they were relying on letting out schools to harvest cotton, essentially slave labor. My conclusion was that the solution to their problem with irrigation infrastructure falling apart was markets. They needed some way to facilitate incentives to do better, to apply water efficiently, to, farmers know how to grow cotton in Uzbekistan. My federal agency did not particularly like what I was advising. They wanted to sell more big yellow machines and so on to Uzbekistan. After I had made the initial reports, they decided that was enough, and they quit paying me. I felt that this was a major triumph on my part.
So if you'll beg my indulgence, Judy mentioned that young people have a different perspective on the beneficial role of capitalism in our society. And I just happen to have two young people in the front row. I was wondering if they wanted to comment on your attitude towards the relative benefits of capitalism and socialism. I'm talking about my son and daughter-in-law. This is why the awkward silence here.
I think I would say a simple thing in a funny setting, which is I am not a dogmatic person. I'm interested in solutions to problems. And so if you have a given solution, whether it's Uzbekistan or the United States, people or countries, I think you should see what's going, and talk to the people who are involved, look at existing options, see if any of them are good enough to employ. And if they're not, create a new one. If you want to call it capitalism, you want to call it socialism, that's sort of high-minded, I think, for the people who have to live the reality. So I guess representing young people, I'd say focus more on the actual life you provide and less on what you call it.
So I'm having fun. I hope you are too. We almost never do this. We used to do this every Sunday, actually, to have people respond. It was considered bad form at some point. I kind of like it. Since I've been doing the choosing up till now, we have time, I think, for one more person that might want to say something. Do I have any volunteers? Everybody's hunky-dory with capitalism? Okay.
I'll take the final word. I was not up here to make a plug for capitalism. I said that most economies are mixed economies. That's what I meant. Our economy is a mixed economy.
And some would say mixed up. Okay. Let's bring this to a close. We actually have a closing hymn. Our world is one world.
Number 134.
The seas that wash our crowns closing words today are from Kenneth Boulding, a well-known economist. I think he was at the University of Michigan. Below the stars, above the mud, people seek to find their highest good. They're partly traitors and partly heroes between infinity and zero. Humans occupy a middle place, 1 foot in sin and 1 in grace. And now for our musical benediction, There Is a Love. Extinguish the candle. Just a minute. Please join me in the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame that it might grow gently in our heart. May it light our paths as we leave this place. May it guide our way until we are together again. You're all welcome to join us downstairs for coffee and conversation. Go in peace and stay for coffee. Thank you.